And now is the time we enter into our period of meditation. Our meditation in which we continue to honor the season of nonviolence. So I ask you to just gently close your eyes or find maybe a spot just to soften your gaze. And let's just take a deep breath together and just hold for maybe just one moment. And then just gently release. In today's meditation, I will go through a series of affirmations, and I ask for you just to bask in those affirmations or just to silently repeat them to yourself, whatever you feel the most comfortable with. Our first is for respect. I show respect and consideration for people around me, no matter their age, race, sex, nationality, or anything else that may make them appear separate from me. Everyone I come across receives my thoughtful consideration. In turn, I act in such a way that garners respect from others. I am reliable and trustworthy, and I generously honor others. And I, in turn, notice that mutual respect is forever increasing around me. I also respect the earth and nature for all it gives to support my life. I respect the divine spirit of life and affirm balance in all of my dealings with both people and the planet. Nonviolence. I strive to overcome violence in myself, in my thoughts, my words, and my actions. I recognize the potency of my thoughts, so I'm learning to overcome any negative thinking. I replace all negative thoughts with positive and supportive ideas. I work to react to crises and injustices with solutions and positive responses. I am learning to manage my communications and relationships with skill and with tact. As I do so, I am building a community of support that will always overcome violence. I realize as I transform my own inner landscape that I also transform any aggressive tendencies in my world. And I invite you to just allow these affirmations to just begin to flow through you and around you and extending beyond just the walls of this room and out to the people of Madison, the state of Wisconsin, and beyond. As we enter into our moment of silence. And as we begin to bring our presence, our attention back to this time and place, we also honor and send kindness. My way of being is kindness. I treat everyone in my life with kindness. By exuding kindness in all directions, I am bathed in gentle waves of support and love. I am caring and I am gentle with people. I act and I speak in a way that shows I care about others, and I go out of my way to help those in need. For loving kindness is the essence of who I am. And I invite you just to take another deep cleansing breath. And on the out breath, just envision these wonderful, beautiful things, these energies of healing and white light and kindness and compassion going out to everyone on this planet. And we breathe in and we breathe out. And we say, so it is, and namaste. Trying to remember what's next here. Do you all realize that we seldom ever even have to go outside of this church for wonderful talent? Let's all give ourselves a big hand. And thank you again, Ari John. That was wonderful. So today, or first of all, I guess I'm going to just start by saying good snowy morning. I'm finally starting to see a little bit of the snow everybody was talking about. And I know they've been plowing the parking lot, but I look up and see a mound of snow that's probably taller than I am. So, yeah, I'm starting to, in her opening prayer this morning, Debbie mentioned the spring, and let me just tell you, I'm starting to feel that a little bit. Starting to want some of that warmth on my skin. So anyway, that's the Texan coming out of me. But today is our second Sunday where we are honoring and observing the season of nonviolence. And I meant to get these out last week, and I finally got them out this week. But basically what it is, it's a season of nonviolence, almost like a daily word, where you can go through, and season of nonviolence runs all the way through the end of April. We're not going to quite talk about it for quite that long just because we start running into Lent, but it does go through the end of April. So I've made some copies of these, and it's, like I said, it's like a daily word through the season of nonviolence, and they're free in the bookstore if anybody's interested in picking one up after the service. It's a nice little thing to kind of keep it fresh and foremost on your mind, and it's got some really great quotes, and I think there's some affirmations and stuff like that in it. So if you'd like one, they're free in the bookstore, so definitely feel free to pick one of those up. Now, to start the talk today about nonviolence, one of the things I spoke about last week was I mentioned one of our 5 unity principles, and that is that we must start to walk the walk. We can't just go out and read books and feel all warm and fuzzy and be like, okay, well, that's great. I now know all this intellectually. That's great, but we have to take what we learn intellectually and start putting it into our daily practice. And this is where we take those teachings out of books in the classroom and we begin to apply them into the real world. That's when we begin to not just study what we learn, but we live what we learn. So you may hear this and think, this is the moment where I get out and I do some volunteer work. Maybe I do some meditation, go out and join a yoga class. Maybe I treat people a little bit more nicely. Well, yes, you should be doing those things. But while those are things that we should be doing, that's not exactly what I'm talking about here, and we'll get into that a little bit. Now, in her book, The 5 Unity Principles, Unity Minister Reverend Evin states, living the truth is more about being rather than doing. More about being rather than just doing. So you're like, okay, so it's not just doing, I have to be this. Well, yes, but we're going to get into that. But it's how we show up for whatever we choose to do. It's how we show up in our daily lives. And you might be saying, well, living the truth and the principles isn't going out and showing the world how spiritual we are. It's not going out and standing on the street corner singing hymns or saying affirmations. Well, a little bit, kind of yes and no. It's kind of a little bit of a juggle with those. Now, in our book, and I mentioned this book last week, we also have these in the bookstore. The Dalai Lama mentions, I have come to the conclusion that whether or not a person is a religious believer doesn't matter much. Far more important is that they be a good human being. Be a good human being. Now, before we go much deeper into that, I want to add something, because some of you may be thinking, well, that's like in a little bit of a conflict with unity teachings, to be a good human being. Reverend Ellen Davenport mentions that we are all inherently good. Every one of us is inherently good. We don't ever strive to be a good human being because we already all are human beings. Good human beings. It doesn't mean that some of us haven't veered off the path a little bit, because that tends to happen even with myself. Ministers aren't exempt from that. It doesn't mean that we haven't kind of veered off and experiencing what unity calls a sin, that false sense of separation. Those things happen to us. We do sometimes occasionally feel like we veered off the path a little bit, or feel that false sense of separation, but we are still all expressions of God. Therefore, we are all inherently good. Okay, and I've kind of veered off on a tangent a little bit, but I didn't want you to read that and be like, well, is that saying that some people are good and some aren't? No, it means we're all good, but sometimes we have veered off the path. So back to the Dalai Lama's statement. He mentions being a good human being, and I want to translate that a little bit, and instead of saying that, let's say living the truth. I think I like that one a little bit better. So instead of saying good human beings, we'll say living our truth. And I say this, living the truth, over just what religions teach. The Dalai Lama mentions, and I say religions, he mentions major religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Sikhism, and others. He talks about those because each one, at their core, is directed towards helping other people to live their truth, or helping us, ourselves, to live our truth. And that each one of those religions is capable of doing that. But does that mean that you have to belong to one of these major religions in order to do your part in facilitating living our truth? Not at all. It's because we are already these things at our core. It's just that sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we tend to forget. And when we do, that's okay. That's part of this human experience. We're going to forget. We're not all going to walk around in this cloud of all the time remembering that we're good or that the world is rainbows and unicorns. We're going to forget sometimes. If you've got breath in your body, you're going to forget occasionally. And when we do, we just need to bring our awareness back around to living our truth, to living who it is we really are. Now, one of the ways in which we can do this is by bringing God into our daily experience. Now, I mentioned the word God, but feel free to substitute whatever word works for you, whether it's divine or universe or whatever word works for you when I use the term God. And in unity, we would refer to it more as that connection within as well. We're not talking about God as an external deity. We're talking about bringing it back into that connection with God or the divine. And we're all sitting in church this morning. We're all looking around saying, well, hey, we got the connection going. We're all sitting in church right now. Seems like it would be the first and foremost on our minds, doesn't it? Sitting in church. But yet we forget far too often. Sometimes we'll feel it when we're here in church and in the presence of other people that also have that connection, that conscious connection of the divine within. But sometimes it's hard to remember when we're outside of these walls, just going about and living our daily lives. And it's easy because life continues to happen all around us, doesn't it? It's not like life takes time to ask, hey, are you bringing God into your daily experience? Life just often doesn't work that way. Life just keeps coming at us, whether it's good or bad or a little indifferent. We look at the bills that need to be paid, the fact that the house needs a new roof, and I'm probably just talking about my own experience from mine and Mindy's house in Washington, but the kids or the grandkids need the latest and greatest technical gadgets, and we don't know which one to buy. That can start probably adding a little bit of stress. And we start getting bogged down in the daily experience of life, and sometimes we start to forget about that connection. And what happens when we bring God into our daily experience, especially during our interactions with others? You think we might be able to practice nonviolence a little bit more, maybe in even a big way, and have even a greater impact? Now, you think it might also play into the ways in which we extend compassion to others, even beginning to further our practice of the season of nonviolence. Now, the Dalai Lama mentions a Tibetan word, and y'all, if y'all are familiar with this at all, I am probably going to botch it. So if I do, just substitute the right pronunciation. But it's called Sopa. And he tells us that it's basically translated, there really is no good English translation. So he tells us that it's basically translated as patience and able to bear or able to withstand. And that Sopa is what provides us with the strength to resist suffering and protects us from losing compassion even for those who would harm us. And he also tells us that Sopa is the means by which we practice true nonviolence, because it is what enables us to not only to refrain from physical reactions when maybe sometimes somebody else makes us feel a little provoked, but it enables us to let go of any negative thoughts and any negative emotions as well. Now, I fully believe, after reading about this, that bringing God into our daily experience will allow us to gain an even deeper practice of Sopa. Now, I also wanted to ask, because a certain man came to mind when I was thinking about this talk, but has anybody in the room ever heard of a man named by the name of Brother Lawrence? Okay, I figured some people in here would have. For those of you who haven't, he was a monk back in the 1600s. And he wrote and kept letters of bringing God into his daily experience. Now, in 1692, after Brother Lawrence had already transitioned from this life, those letters were gathered up and they were placed into a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. And we studied that book and the writings of Brother Lawrence during my ministerial school. And it's a little bit more traditional in nature, probably, if you read the book. But it talks about how Brother Lawrence developed a simple way of praying from his heart, which he called practicing the presence of God. And he learned to commune with God continuously. He viewed God as a little bit more of an external deity, but we could view it as more of keeping that constant connection open with God or the divine. not only just in church. Brother Lawrence did this not only just when he was in church and during personal devotions, but he also kept that connection and that presence with God during times when he was working in the kitchen, when he ran errands, or even just when he was sitting and listening to other people. So in other words, he brought the presence of God into his everyday life. And he talks about in his letters how transformational this was for him in his life. Now I realize it's not likely any of us are going to jump up after church today and go join a monastery as a monk. Because they probably, sometimes are a little bit more secluded where you might think, it's probably a little easier for them to practice that connection. But we can all do it too. It doesn't mean that we can't also learn to bring God into our everyday experience. And there are several ways in which we can do this. Now, first, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you start your day. Just kind of bring that awareness to you. What I used to do is I used to open my eyes. They weren't even open yet. I'd be sitting there prying my eyes open, still a little blurry from sleep, but I'd pick up my cell phone. I'd pick it up and I'd start going through my emails right away. Could barely even see them. I wasn't even awake yet. Yet I'm going through my emails, checking out the news, whatever it is I feel like checking at the time. In doing that, it was no wonder that so many of my days were starting off with feeling stress or starting off just setting the tone for a little bit of chaos. Whatever it was, it most definitely didn't feel, at least, like I was including God in my daily experience, at least at that moment. And let's be realistic for a moment. There's going to be a time during the day where we're probably going to have to check email, right? We're going to at least have to take a peek at the news to see what's going on. So I'm not saying not to do those things and that we completely cut God off when we do. I'm just inviting you to think about what it is, what you're using to kind of set the tone as you start your day. Because sometimes all it takes is just a minute to set the tone in a little bit of a different direction than we'd probably want to go. One in which we aren't necessarily bringing God into our daily experience to start the day. Now, my yoga program has kind of helped a little bit because it includes a practice for some nice stretches. And I get to do these actually before I get out of bed. Now, do I always? No, because sometimes coffee is a little more important at the time. But when I can remember to do that, I will do those. Because you might think, well, stretching, that really doesn't seem like a big deal. But for me, it's more than just stretching. Because when I do it, I'm aware of that present moment. I'm aware that there's nowhere else I have to be right there in that moment. I'm aware of just my physical body, the sensations that I'm feeling, and what is just going on right there in that time and space. And it also helps to loosen tension and start me off with kind of a loose release rather than reaching for my phone and seeing what's going on and immediately feeling stress. Now, I'm not asking you to start yoga or start stretching, but I just want to ask you to think about how to start your day or how you start your day. Does it include just being, even if only for a moment? Because when we do this, when we take that time to be for just a moment, when we take time to just be, we are bringing God into our daily experience. And if nothing else, we're at least opening that channel to where we can bring God into our daily experience. Now remember, I mentioned Brother Lawrence practiced this in the kitchen. He did it by washing dishes. Now I realize back in the 1600s, there weren't TVs blaring in every room or, you can't even get out and pump gas anymore without that little TV blaring commercials at you. But Brother Lawrence didn't have those things, but it didn't matter. He showed just how we all can just slow down and focus on what we're doing at any given moment and to just be no matter what we're doing. It's just a practice giving our full attention and our presence to whatever it is we're doing. Mindfulness, just being in that present moment. Now, another thing I wanted to touch on slightly here, and I'm not going to go too deeply into it because Reverend Linda is going to do that for us next week, but I wanted to talk about prayer. because I fully feel like it is worth a mention here today. Now, the Association for Global New Thought, or AGNT, helps to drive the season of nonviolence. And they mention prayer as being a big factor in practicing nonviolence. Imagine that, prayer in practicing nonviolence. But they state on their website, we can pray. Prayer is powerful and effective and should precede all actions. We pray for ourselves with strength, patience, and intelligence to do this work, and for guidance and wisdom to say and do the right thing as we walk on this path. We pray for each other. We pray for our leaders, our nation, all life, and the planet. We pray for our adversaries. Holding negative thoughts about our leaders or adversaries is counterproductive. It leads to polarization and alienation. Pray for their well-being, guidance, and a positive resolution of any differences between us. We can pray or hold an intention for an expected outcome and for win-win solutions which provide the highest benefit for all concerned. But then we need to let it go. That's the big key. We pray, we put the intention out there, and then we let it go. We don't try to drive the outcome, we let it go. Now, there have been times in my life, admittedly, where I have prayed a great deal of times, and times where I have gone a while without prayer. I feel kind of ashamed to admit that being a minister, but it happens to all of us. There's those times where we focus more on prayer and times we shouldn't. Does anybody else relate to that? Now, one of those times, I will admit, one of those times where I was heavily involved in prayer was when I was in boot camp in the military. And there were times I would beg God. I would go back to that whole Baptist beseeching way. One time really stands out at me. Now, in boot camp, they would come in there. It wasn't a gentle, you weren't in bed asleep, and a gentle person come and just tap on your shoulder and say, Evan, you need to wake up. It wasn't like that. They would come in, they'd be flipping the lights on and off, hitting trash cans, get up, get up, get up. That was the way you were woken up. And during this time, while lights are flashing on and off, you're in a stupor of sleep, you have to get your uniform on. It has to look good. You have to make your bed, and you've got to get downstairs, ready to sing the Air Force song. And this is all in 5 minutes. So one night, we're getting close to the end of boot camp, and me and some of the guys in my bunk were like, let's get a little smart. Let's get up about middle of the night or so, and let's go ahead and put some of our uniforms on. That way we'll be good and ready to go. So sure enough, we're all up, putting uniforms on. We hear, we're like, oh no, they're going to do an inspection. And we didn't have time. We didn't have time to put our uniforms back on. I had my pants on. So we get back in bed, and my uniform shirt's still hanging there. My belt buckle flies off. So I'm down on the floor in the dark looking around for it. I couldn't find it. So I'm like, well, it's just going to have to stay there. So I'm laying there with my pants on, and the drill sergeant's coming through, and they're shining lights on uniforms. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if they see my pants are gone, I'm going to be in so much trouble. That was a time I was praying. I was like, oh dear God, please do not let them look at my uniform. Please do not let them do it. He shined the light on it, but luckily he didn't open the shirt to see if my pants were hanging there. It was by the grace of God that nobody got caught. And that belt buckle, I found it clear under the other person's bed. So, yeah, it was. But prayer is so much more than just that, right? It's almost like having that constant open line with the divine. And it kind of reminds me of that game that kids used to play where you would, take a cup and tie the string to it and with the other cup, and you'd listen to each other. And kids probably, I guess nowadays, have cell phones as early as 3. I've seen like little toddlers like moving through those phones like it's nobody's business. So I don't know if they still use the cups. But it's what I envision when I envision prayer. You've got that open line of communication there, and it's always connected. Just like the string used to connect cups, you've always got that connection. And when something happens in our day to make us feel a little out of sorts, we can remember that connection. And that connection can most definitely help us to diffuse a situation, right? If we're in a situation with another person or at work, when we go back and we remember that connection, it can help us start to diffuse maybe any tension or anything like that we might be allowing ourselves to feel. Now I'll admit here, and if you're on my Facebook, you may have seen it, but I'm still a little guilty of allowing myself to get a little too involved in social media conversations. I'll tell you, Mindy's back there laughing because she knows. I'll tell her, I'll be like, oh, I had to set this person straight. I couldn't deal with it. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I hope somebody from the church didn't see that. But when I do that, I forget that link myself, right? I start forgetting that my own link with the divine, at least initially. And there are several times when my fingers start flying over the keyboard. I'm like, I got to set this person straight. My fingers are flying 90 miles an hour. But then sometimes I remember. And several times, more often than not lately, I've got a whole paragraph on there that I'm prepared to hit send on. And then I remember and I just delete it and go on. Sometimes it feels good just to type it even without sending it. But that link to God, to the divine, that remembering of bringing God into my daily experience allows me to just pause for a moment and to feel. Just to feel the love that I feel when I've got that connection with the divine, and how, instead of firing off something that doesn't sound very nice, I can instead just hold that person in love, whether we agree with each other or not. And so this kind of brings me to my next point. Some of you may be thinking up to this point, well, Evan, I already practiced nonviolence. I'm already doing a pretty good job. I don't go out and hit people. I don't fire off too much on social media. I don't riot. I'm not bringing any kind of physical harm on anybody. And that's good because we don't want to do that. But violence isn't only accomplished through physical means. It's through our words too, isn't it? Those words on social media, that wasn't actually going out and hitting anybody, but those words can sting pretty deeply sometimes. What words do we use when we interact with others? With ourselves even? How do we practice nonviolence even in our words? Author and spiritual teacher, and this may be another name that I botch, Amit Ray, once stated, the more we practice nonviolence in our words, thoughts, and actions, the more peaceful we will be, or the more peaceful will be our inner state. So let's face it, I mentioned words and how they can cut, and words can cut deeply into the bones sometimes, can't they? We may move through forgiveness, but words that somebody has used with us are sometimes things that we will never forget. Sometimes we will always remember those things. I'm willing to bet each and every one of us in this room has had unkind words spoken to us out of anger. Words that we may have forgiven, but we haven't forgotten. We remember how that feels. We remember how those words made us feel. And we can't go back and change what may have been said to us in the past, but we can do our part and not try to inflict the same thing onto someone else. When we pause and we really think about our words, and I touched on that a bit last week, but when we pause and we really think about our words, whether spoken or typed, we can become mindful. We can become mindful about the impact that they're going to have on another person. And if they aren't kind, we can choose to just delete them or just to not say them. This is both bringing God into our daily lives and doing our part to practice nonviolence. So to end, the AG&T site lists the top skills of a peacemaker. Now I've changed some of those skills into affirmations, and I'd like to invite you to repeat them after me if you're willing. So I ask now, are you willing? All right. Now I'm going to say them, and feel free to repeat them silently or out loud, whatever you feel most comfortable with. I align myself with the spiritual power of peace versus living hopelessness and anguish. I honor, value, and cherish everyone versus degrading or attacking anyone. I calm fears and thought versus creating or escalating anxiety. I listen with an open heart versus condemning. I seek to understand versus assuming. I include everyone versus excluding anyone. I unify versus divide and separate. I celebrate diversity, individuality, intolerance, and prejudice. I support justice and fairness versus favoritism and inequality. And lastly, I respond with compassionate action versus failing to care or act. So the practice of nonviolence may seem like a no-brainer for most of us. Most of us probably wonder why we would even need to be in need in such a movement or a season to actually practice nonviolence. To find the need to even practice something that should come as first nature, right? But it is needed, maybe more now than ever. Or maybe they said more now than ever 100 years ago. I don't know. But I do know that it is needed. And you are needed in this season of nonviolence. You are needed to help practice nonviolence out in the world. I am needed. We are all needed. And I fully believe that we are all being called upon to do our part in that movement. We are all being called upon to do our part to practice nonviolence. And I invite you to continue to join me upon this journey of peace and of love. Are you all willing? Thank you and namaste.